Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today, in a continuation of my series where I take a look at the legendary lords, starting armies and locations in Total War Warhammer 3 and then rank them for new players, we will be taking a look at the Vampire Coast Lords, which all come with a Vampire Coast DLC for Total War Warhammer 2 and 3, where you'll be ranking the lords, their starting positions, starting armies, and assessing how much fun they are for new players or for people who have recently bought the DLC. Please like and or subscribe if you enjoy the video. Feel free to leave a comment, I'll reply to any that are left. Big thank you to everyone who's already subscribed, and without further ado, let's get into the video. As you can see, there are 4 legendary lords for the Vampire Coast, and we shall go over all of them. So starting here with Luthor Harkon and his faction, the Awakened. Luthor starts over here in Lustria. He's not moved since the second game. It's quite an interesting start position, near quite a few lizard men. I think his start position is a lot easier than it used to be because he's no longer next to Teclis, who used to start here. Teclis is now down here. This means he's actually got quite a lot for him to expand, and he does quite well against lizard men in battles. So he's got a relatively easy start when compared to other factions in the Vampire Coast roster. Starting army-wise, he has quite a big starting army, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's overly good. So we will briefly go over them now. So firstly, Zombie Pirate Deckhands. These are a very standard meat shield unit. They are not very good at anything other than just absorbing damage. The Gunnery Mob variant, this version has a pistol. They have a lot less health though, and they're certainly not as tanky as the Deckhand Mob. They do a bit of damage, they're not awful, especially if you have a few of them. Deck Droppers with handgunners, I don't rate these. These are like a slightly better version of Felgrats, and this isn't even the cannon variant, this is the variant with handguns. They don't do a lot of damage realistically, not that much range, not much ammo, not high missile strength, although it is armour piercing, which I suppose is pretty good for the early game. Scurvy Dogs, these are very, very similar to any other kind of Warhound or Warbeast unit that other factions have. They're very fast, they have no armour, low leadership, low melee attack, low melee defence. They're very mediocre. They're okay at taking out artillery units and weakly armoured cavalry units, and that is about it. This is the standard variant Deck Droppers, even worse. This variant just has pistols, crap range, crap missile strength, non-armour piercing. They are shite. I would never recruit them, and I don't think you'll get much value out of them at the start of the game. Animated Hulks, these are a bit like Chaos Spawn, that kind of anti-infantry, armour-piercing damage dealer monster unit for the early game. They are only tier 2, they're quite tanky, they do decent damage, they're not amazing at all, but they're also not awful. Bloated Corpses, these are a very unique unit. They are shite, and other than in auto-resolve, they will not perform well at all unless you manage to blob the enemy up. Because if you don't know what they do, essentially they stand there looking like a big chunky man, they spot something, they run at it, they pop. Now normally they will kill the unit they're attacking, especially if it's a multiple entity unit, but the unit is then completely removed. You don't get it back after the battle, it no longer exists within the battle, and it served its purpose, and they almost never get their money's worth. They are quite fun, and at the start of the game they can be quite memey if you can blob up the enemy, but this doesn't mean they're good, and they're not good. Finally, Mortars. This is their version of Mortars that the Empire has. It is not very good. I don't rate Mortars. I think they're really inaccurate, and they fire too slowly. They're okay at dealing with walls and in sieges, and if you blob the enemy up, you can get some good kills with them. They're not an awful unit to start the game with, but the Vampire Coast has a lot better artillery to kind of implement throughout this campaign. So his starting army, whilst quite big, is quite mediocre, but he has some interesting faction and lord effects. So faction-wise, he has plus 60 relations with the followers of Nagash. This is Arkon's faction. Relatively interesting mechanic. Arkon starts over here, so not too far away really, and you can get some trade deals up, and that's about it, to be honest. With the new mechanics, suppose you could recruit some Tomb King's units, which could be quite interesting, but that's all it really allows you to do. It is better in this game than the previous one, but this doesn't mean it's a good faction effect. Minus 100 diplomatic relations with Vampire Coast mutineers. You're never going to be doing stuff with them anyway, so this just means you're going to hate them even more. They start off as your enemy faction, and you'll be killing them quite quickly. This is not a very interesting thing to have in your faction, it's just a bit of flavour. Melee defense plus 6 for Lords and Embedded Heroes. 6 melee defense isn't that much, especially when Lords and Heroes often have a fair amount of it. However, this is a better buff than a lot of other stats that they could be increasing by 6, and it does mean that they are 6% less likely to be hit in melee, which can be quite good, especially for caster Lords and caster Heroes, and it's okay for hit as well. Not amazing, but not absolutely awful. Diplomatic relations minus 60 with lizard men. bit like the other two, only this does mean that you'll be very, very unlikely to be able to establish any kind of diplomatic relations with lizardmen factions around you. Not that I'd recommend doing that as Vampire Coast, but if you wanted to, you're really going to struggle down here because all the lizardmen factions are going to have another 60 on top of why they already hate you. Lord-wise, he has some pretty interesting effects. +3 vampiric corruption in the local province. This is pretty good because when you're attacking provinces, you can just build up the corruption really, really quickly, get nice and corrupt, get your public order stabilised, destabilise the enemy's public order, etc. This is a really nice thing to have, if a little bit low. +8 leadership when fighting against lizardmen. Vampire Coast do struggle with leadership. Obviously, they have the crumbling mechanic, and with the update brought out yesterday, crumbling is more deadly than ever before. So this just means, especially on high difficulties, that your units are more likely to stay in the fight for longer. So this is not a bad thing to have, and you'll be fighting a lot of lizardmen down here in Lustria. Finally, his entire army gets 25% spell resistance. Now, this seems better than it is, mainly because the AI does actually use spells now. I know in the previous game it didn't, but they are more aggressive now, and they do use spells, and this means your army will take 25% less damage from spells. Everything, from artillery to the generals to big blobs of units, which is just quite nice to have, especially when fighting lizardmen, because, you know, if they manage to get Croak and they use Deliverance of Itza on you, there will be issues. He himself is pretty good in combat. He's a hybrid ranged melee lord. He does fairly good in duels, fairly good at long range, by picking off some kills. And he's got some quite cool magic items, but he's not amazing. Next up is Count Noctilus of the Dread Fleet, quite a different lord to Luthor Harkon. He starts here in the Galleon's Graveyard, this slightly weird place where you can build yourself up just south of Ulthuan, but it's not actually connected to any of the continents. So you can pick where you'd like to invade. His starting army, whilst a lot smaller than Luthor's, I think is a lot better, and we will go through that now. Zombie Pirate Deckhands, standard, meat shield, not great, not awful. Handgunner variant of the gunnery mob, once again, armour piercing, does a bit of damage. They're better than the pistol variant, not awful. Necrofex Colossus. Now this is only a tier 3 unit, but my god is it a brilliant one. These are large, giant-like monsters that do a lot of artillery damage, they're armour piercing, amazing range, pretty good ammo, good in melee as well. They have good health, they're good and tanky. They're a really, really good unit, especially for the early game, which obviously you're starting with one is excellent. Depth Guard, these are the kind of decent melee units for the Vampire Coast. They look really cool, they're anti-infantry, not armour piercing unfortunately, but they're quite tanky with 90 armour and a good health pool. Only 60 units, but they can do quite a lot of damage if left unchecked. So a semi-decent starting army realistically, with some decent units like the Depth Guard and the Necrofex in there. Very interesting and I think pretty good faction and lord effects though. Firstly, his faction just gets war declaration missions with unique rewards. So you'll get a mission to declare war on someone. You may not have met them yet. You declare war on them. You perform other things that the mission will ask you, and you get cool unique rewards, items, and so on. It's very cool and a very interesting way of kind of spicing up his faction a bit more. +60 diplomatic relations with followers of Nagash. Same as Luthor. Followers of Nagash, just over here, down here. It's a little bit further away, but it's still good. Nice way to get alliances, trade, alliance units, etc. Horde recruitment capacity +2. This is very good. It means that your hordes can recruit a lot faster. When combined with the bottom one, it means you can get good units up very quickly. The bottom one, as you can see here, -1 turn for Necrofex Colossus units. Now, their standard recruitment duration just normally will be 2, so this just means you get a turn recruitment duration for these, although in other settlements it can be 3 or 4, and this knocks it down again, and does stack with other recruitment removals, obviously just down to 1 turn. This is excellent though. As I said, Necrofex Colossus are a really good unit. You can get them relatively early on as well, and this just means built into the faction, all your armies have reduced recruitment duration and can recruit more as a capacity. So you can get your armies up nice and quickly with these decent artillery giant units. Lord-wise, he only has 2 abilities, but I think they're pretty good. 20% upkeep reduction for Necrofex Colossus units is excellent. So obviously he starts with 1, so that's -20% reduction on that, and any more he recruits into his army will cost 20% less. This just kind of keeps the cost down, helps your economy a bit, it's just quite fun. +15% for large units. Vampire Coast do not have tons of good large units, but they have a few, including Necrofex Colossus, and 15% weapon strength is a big buff for all of them. It makes some of them a little bit better, like the massive crab unit they have, and they can be pretty good, and so the weapon strength increase certainly helps with that. He himself is anti-large, so he's pretty good in melee, but he becomes really good in the later game when he can ride a Necrofex Colossus into battle, which is a brilliant mount for him to have, and makes him, I think, the best Vampire Coast Legendary Lord. Next up is Aranessa Saltspite of the Pirates of Sartosa, the shitties faction for the Vampire Coast. Starts here, like she did before in Sartosa. Bit of a weird position, the kind of entrance to these atolls. You can go and deal with various human factions, but it's not a very easy start. Her starting army is shit, because she gets hybrid units that are human as well. She gets really crap hybrid units. So if we have a look, Sartosa Free Company. This is an example of this. These are an anti-infantry melee unit, but they are crap in melee, really. Not much armour, not much health, and they have pretty crummy weapon strength as well. This just means they're not very good at doing what they're meant to do. I would not recommend ever recruiting these, and I don't think they're a good unit to start with. Deck Gunners, these are a good unit, but not exclusive to her. These are an armour-piercing kind of hold unit. They have decent ammo, decent range. They have really good missile strength, which both pierces armour but also reduces missile block chance. They are obviously awful in melee, but their job is to hit things at long range, and they are good at doing that. Sartosa Militia, these are the Empire's Free Company Militia, but renamed and with a slightly different skin. Free Company Militia, if you see my Empire video, you know my opinion on them. I think they're absolutely god-awful, and they're no better here, especially with the really good range units that the Vampire Coast have. This is absolutely god-awful. They're crap in melee, they're crap at range, they have awful ammo, awful missile strength, awful in melee. Nah, piece of shit. Rotting Prometheans, these are the giant crab units I was talking about before. They aren't very good, to be honest. They look really cool, and that's about as far as they go. They have mediocre melee attack, they are very tanky, I grant, and they have armour-piercing attacks with a mediocre weapon strength, but they have a low charge bonus, and they're not very fast. So, Scurvy Dogs, standard shit. Not worth recruiting realistically. Very mediocre early game unit. And Zombie Pirate Gunnery Mob Bombers, this is the kind of grenade variant. They kind of throw bombs. They don't have much range, but they have explosive attacks. Not much ammo either. Once they run out of ammo, they are even worse. They can be quite good, but their lack of ammo and the fact they're so bad in melee means that they shouldn't really be filling up an army spot, but they are okay at the start of the game. So, when looking at Aranessa's faction effects, she has some interesting ones that can be quite useful for the Vampire Coast. So firstly, minus 100 diplomatic relations with Norsca. She's not really very near Norsca. It's a bit of a weird thing to have built in. I think it's more of a lore-based thing. But it doesn't really do a lot. I never really find it affects her campaign massively. The Vampire Coast treasure map mechanic, where you get a map, it tells you to go somewhere, and then you go there and you get some money or an item. She gets these more often. If you like that mechanic, great. I personally don't like it. I think it's a little bit, just it takes you away from your campaign objectives and kind of expanding out your territory. But she gets them more often, so if you like doing them, this is good. Income from raiding, 50%. Vampire Coast is good at raiding. So if you want to raid up in the Human Kingdoms here, or over here in the Orc and Dwarf lands, you'll get 50% more income, pretty juicy. Income from sacking settlements, plus 20%, is really nice. Sacking settlements is often the best way to make money, and she makes 20% more, so that helps kind of stimulate your economy a bit more. Lord-wise, she has some absolutely dreadful effects. Starting with, she has a plus 12 to her character's aura leadership effect. Now, I think aura leadership is awful as a mechanic. I just think it's bad. I think when the Lord dies, the army's more likely to run away anyway, etc, etc. And this just means that the army has a small leadership buff when she's alive, and then loses even more leadership when she inevitably dies because she's not very good in combat. Quite mediocre, really. Melee attack plus 8 for Sartosan units, and 20% weapon strength for Sartosan units. Sartosan units are shite. They are these, and maybe one more, I can't actually remember. But nothing incredible. They're all human-based units, low-tier Empire or Bretonia-style units. They don't really do a lot, and she gives these very mediocre buffs to them. She is also very, very mediocre in combat. She is just not a very good lord. Next up, we have Cylostra Direfin, or Direfin of the Drowned faction. She starts up here, near Lithanar, Dark Elf factions, Kartet, Taurox, etc. It's quite a difficult start, but a lot more interesting than her previous start in Lustria. Her starting army is quite mediocre. It's Zombie Pirate Deck Camp, Polearm variant. These do say anti-large. They're not going to be killing any large units. They're very squishy. They are, as they say, meat shield. They are the meat shield, as all Zombie Pirate Deck units are. This variant is just slightly better at killing off cav, I guess. Zombie Pirate Gunnery Mob, this is the pistol variant. Once again, very mediocre. No armour piercing. Pistols don't do much damage. They're crap in melee. Carronade, these are decent. These are armour piercing, anti-large cannons with a decent range, decent reload, decent ammo and missile strength. They're not bad. Especially as a siege artillery, they're good at taking down walls, especially, and other large units like giants and so on. Sirens, these are the ethereal kind of unit. They have enthralling attacks. They're armour piercing. They have magical attacks. They're pretty cool. Pretty good. Standard ethereal, they don't take very much physical damage, but they don't have any armour, so magical damage will really hurt them. It's usually about 55%-ish with ethereal physical resistance, so they're pretty good, especially against other non-magical melee units. Finally, Mongols. This is a unit that she shares with the vampire counts now. Armour-piercing anti-infantry, monstrous unit. Good weapon strength, good speed. I really like Mongols. They look really cool and they can rip apart low to mid-tier armoured and unarmoured infantry units, especially because they have stalk and they're quite fast. Faction-wise, she's got some decent effects. Lord effects, not so much. So faction-wise, +2 loyalty for new recruits. They do have the loyalty mechanic. So having higher loyalty just baseline is always good, because loyalty, if it degrades itself, although it's easy to circumvent, it is still annoying, and when they spawn into an enemy army you have to kind of go back and deal with them. So this is a nice way of kind of circumventing that. Reduced upkeep and recruitment cost, 20% both ways for Cyrene and Mongol units. Syrenes are good, and so are Mongols. I would recruit Mongols and possibly Syrenes into my army anyway, so this is just a nice way of reducing upkeep and recruitment cost, and this is across the whole faction, so that's pretty cool. Lord-wise, she gives her army magical attacks. This is mediocre. Magical attacks are useful against some factions with high physical resistances, but a lot of factions don't really care either way, and some factions even have more magical resistance. So this is fine, but not that exciting. It's quite good on ranged units, I suppose. And then she has 5% physical resistance. This is so low that it doesn't really matter. It means her units will take 5% less physical damage, essentially. This is not amazing. In fact, it's crap, because it's not high enough to make a massive difference, and a lot of units that would benefit from having a higher physical resistance don't benefit enough from 5%. She herself is pretty good in combat. She's obviously a caster, so not very good in melee, but she's got cool kind of Lore of the Deep spells where she summons ships and tentacles and shit to do damage, and she's pretty good at that. So, ranking these for new players and for people who recently bought the DLC and kind of difficulty and enjoyment, I would recommend starting with Noctilus. I think he has the best faction and lord effects. I think his starting army is fun and quite balanced. I think he's got a lovely starting position where he can go and pick sides. As long as you don't aggro too many elves, you're not going to have a difficult time. Then I would recommend Luthor Harkon. A slightly harder start, but he has a decent, if slightly underpowered starting army, and he's got an interesting position here where he can kind of try and consolidate himself. It is not the easiest start, but that doesn't mean it's not fun. Then Cylostra. She is also pretty fun. Her starting army is pretty fun. She does have quite a difficult start up here, I think, but it can be quite rewarding, especially if you establish yourself here in this kind of outcropping. And she herself is also quite an enjoyable lord. And then finally, if you are a masochist or really bored, play Aranessa. She's got a mediocre starting army, mediocre faction and lord effects. Her start position is not necessarily difficult, but it is really boring, and because she is so mediocre, you're not going to have a lot of fun with her in combat, and you probably will just die to Ickit. So I would recommend not playing her, but if you want to, she is my last recommendation. So that concludes the video for the Vampire Coast Lords and rankings and so on. Please like and or subscribe if you enjoyed it. Feel free to leave a comment down below. I will reply to any that are left. Thank you so much to everyone who's already subscribed. It really means the world to me. I hope you enjoyed it, at least to some extent. And have a great day, folks.